It comes with the absolutely tragic and entirely preventable, in my opinion, passing of transplant once listed transplant recipient, Sheila Annette Lewis in Alberta, and said, "You've covered this story extensively. You had exclusive comments from Sheila and her family, and even as time went on, her legal team. What's your, off the hop thoughts on the unfolding that has seen Miss Lewis pass away tragically?"
Well, of course, as you mentioned, it's a very tragic situation to say the least. I did speak with her family recently. They are taking care of the situation, of course, as any family might have to in this particular matter. But it is tragic all around. We spoke about this on Friday as well. And one can hope that this will not happen again. But we know if nothing changes, that there are other people that are going to suffer the same fate. It's very tragic, and it could have been prevented, as you mentioned. This is something that you look at hospitals internationally. There are many hospitals out there that don't require these same measures for transplants, especially given the fact that Sheila Annette Lewis, she had developed natural immunity to COVID, but still her doctors here in Alberta refused her. Again, it's very tragic, and she isn't the only one out there. So if you do know anybody who is going through these situations, please help them out or speak to the situation at hand.
Yeah, and of course, condolences first and foremost to Sheila's family, and I hope that she rests in peace. And what a powerhouse of a woman! What a strong advocate for bodily autonomy, medical choice. I mean, Sheila even had to go through and retake all of her childhood vaccines that I guess were somehow lost over the course of her life. They didn't have the record of, even though she says that she did receive them. And so, this wasn't someone who is coined as being an anti-vaxxer necessarily. And even if you are arguably wanting to make your own medical choices, then who's to say you should be not denied the care and the treatment that quite literally your tax dollars go into funding? And so, I wonder where the Conservative Party was all throughout this unfolding. But now that Sheila has paid really the ultimate price here, the ultimate sacrifice for upholding those key cornerstones of freedom, which is bodily autonomy and freedom of medical choice. We see on Twitter, Roman Baber, he's the ousted provincial Conservative member of Parliament, who's now running as a federal Conservative member. He took to Twitter to say that the Canada Health Act forbids discrimination, but Sheila Lewis was denied a transplant because of a lawful medical choice. Her death is a tragic failure of medical ethics and the administration of justice. I'll work to right this wrong until the last day of my career. Rest in peace, R.I.P. Sheila. And I think that brings up a really good point, because there's also ethics intertwined in all of this, right? Everybody says, oh, we're following the science, the science, the science. And meanwhile, the science is pretty clear that the injection doesn't prevent transmission, nor does it prevent infection. And so there's that element here of the science, quote unquote, which is usually just pharma funded narratives. But then there's also the ethical element involved in, once again, bodily autonomy and freedom of medical choice. And is it ethical to take somebody off of a donor list when they're a good candidate, right? There's the story that I heard repeatedly from Sheila, and you again said would have more in-depth coverage of this, was that she was a great candidate for an organ transplant. And then all of a sudden the mandates came into effect, the shots were rolled out, and she was arbitrarily removed from that donor list.
Yeah, no, to say the least. And her doctors actually, who were preparing to do this transplant, they had even mentioned to her that they looked forward to her recovery after the transplant was received. They wanted to do this transplant on her. She was a great candidate. She was doing everything right. And I should, express the point. It isn't the fact that, she was anti-vax or anything like that. And in fact, once she proved to or showed to the AHS, Alberta Health Services doctors, that she had natural immunity, they asked that her and her family also get the booster shot. shots. It wasn't just about one, shot of the COVID vaccine, as it were.
Right.
It was about prescribing to the what's turning into or looking like a seasonal thing that they're trying to implement. She wasn't up to date with that, with the system of vaccine adherence, if you want to call it that. It's not about, people make this about, they're anti-vaxxers. They just want to, die on this hill for no reason. Well, it's not just that. It's so much more than that. And this is affecting so many people across the country right now. It's almost unbearable, but you don't hear about it because the very people who, like Sheila Annette Lewis, she's very brave for what she did, because the doctors that are supposed to do the transplant on her, they're the ones who refused because of the vaccination status issue. She then would have had to have gone back to them if she wanted to amend this situation through the system, and they would have been the same doctors doing that transplant later on. So it's also, there's a difficulty there because you want to be on good terms with the person who's going to be performing a life-saving transplant or a life-saving surgery on you. So there are so many difficulties in this situation, and it is tragic all across the board. I'm glad that there are people such as we just mentioned, the fellow I'm blanking on his name. I apologize.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. With Roman Baber, I'm glad that we're seeing politicians speak on on her behalf, and I hope more of them keep doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and then we saw, also going back to Twitter, I guess I should get more in the habit of calling it X now. Elon Musk has changed the name, but leader of the opposition party, Pierre Poilievre, he retweeted Baber's tweet, and he said, "So glad Roman is our conservative candidate. I couldn't agree more." And again, I'm kind of condemning these politicians for being really silent and mum on the issue throughout the duration of the unfoldings with Sheila Annette Lewis, because this was months of fighting the system, essentially. And
Years.
So it's, well, sorry, yeah, years. And again, Sid, this is your report that you could speak more in depth about on. But now it's all of a sudden, now they've come out of the woodwork, right, to denounce the treatment that Sheila was subjected to. And Pierre Poilievre is so glad that Roman is their conservative candidate. And, I am too, in a way, because although it took, they were mum on the topic for so long, Roman Baber, if for anybody who isn't familiar with him, he was one of the first people to speak up against the Doug Ford COVID regime when he was instituting harsh lockdowns, business closures, school closures, when he was really going full force into the COVID hysteria and kowtowing to whatever the public health flavor of the day was during that time. And Baber was one of the first people to stand up and start saying no and voting against some of the heavy-handed legislation that Ford was implementing. And I think it was specifically the extension of the Reopening Ontario Act, which is a really weird double-speak piece of legislation that actually closed Ontario instead of reopened it. So he was one of the first Ontario MPPs to be kicked out of the Ford caucus, and then he switched gears, ran for the federal party, and so Pierre has now retweeted him, and this has really reached the depths of the X platform over the weekend. There's another tweet here. I think this is an NDP. This is an NDP candidate or member. And so they've retweeted now these posts by Roman and Pierre Poilievre. The first person here says, wherein the leader of the Conservative Party celebrates the anti-vax, anti-science, conspiracy-driven, pseudo-scientific ideology, which in the end cost this woman her life. And then there's a related thread there to go through. But this NDP leader then retweeted that. And so it's funny to kind of trace this all back to its roots. And he says, disinformation and conspiracy costs lives. I'm pretty sure it's this faulty notion of following the science that cost this woman her life. But anyway, it is appalling that Pierre Poilievre continues to fan the flame of anti-vax conspiracy. The fact that he is cheering on a candidate who was kicked out of Doug Ford's caucus is telling. He is promoting a party of extremism. And I mean, right off the bat, I don't want to rehash the entire clip because I think it's almost 3 minutes. But the last 2 weeks, I think we've highlighted this clip of the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, our brave, fearless leader, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, where we compiled a clip of almost each and every time that he spouted serious, extreme medical apartheid rhetoric throughout the campaign trail of the fall of 2021. You know, he's clearly he clearly campaigned on the wedge issue of segregation between those who had decided to get vaccinated and those who had made a different alternative medical choice for themselves based on their own individual factors for whatever reason they wanted. He quite literally campaigned on medical apartheid for the COVID shot specifically. And some of the language that he used is extremely dangerous and telling, like, you can't get on a plane or a train or sit next to a vaccinated person and put them at risk. You can't put our children at risk, saying that if you weren't COVID vaccinated, you were somehow going to be killing everybody's children. He went to the depths of extremism, and none of that was ever denounced by any of these people who claim to be fanning the flames of conspiracy. I mean, and this is at a time where we knew point blank that these shots weren't doing anything to prevent infection or prevent transmission. And all of it was based on fallacy and lie, and I dare say misinformation from our very own government and the institutions that they're supposed to be advised by. So what's your takeaway on this kind of like Twitter flame war that's happening around the story of Sheila Annette Lewis, Sid?
Well, in terms of, what we're just touching on there, I don't understand the rhetoric of the NDP and the Liberals and the others who would still continue to advocate for, people to take the shots and to take, the second shot, the booster and the second booster and all of that stuff. It baffles me that they still go down that line of rhetoric. You can see now, everybody can see now the effects that have been caused by it, the damage that's been caused, long-term damage to everyday people. I mean, I'm careful, because we're still on YouTube, and of course censorship is almost at an all-time high here in Canada. It is difficult to speak about these matters, but the fact of it is, they did a lot of wrong to a lot of people by simply advocating for it and implementing it without that heavy consideration as to the damages that might be caused. It was all about the pros and not about the cons of what might happen if we introduce this at a societal level. And that's where we've been left. And now that the evidence is coming in, they're sticking to the same lines. It is truly baffling.
Yeah, it is. And I think that there is an element of dare I say, aloofness here, where it's these individuals seem to quite literally be in this perpetual state of ignorance is bliss. We're going to follow whatever the mainstream consensus is. We won't challenge it. We're not going to think critically. We're going to ignore any evidence of the contrary because it reinforces our preconceived notions. And I mean, that is literally textbook cognitive dissonance. And so I think that is really the root of what is at play here. I mean, and it really, unfortunately, depends on your political stripe and how you seem to vote, because the access, I mean, the information is out there. And as the Liberals try to squash your access to that information by regulating the internet and social media and so on and so forth, and pieces of heavy-handed legislation to enforce all of that, the information is still out there and you can access it, and you don't have to take it at face value, right? If you're any ounce of person who has any ounce of critical thinking capabilities, you can go somewhere like the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, look at some of the presentations that they've done, the videos that they've compiled, the evidence and supporting documents that they have very easily accessible on their website, and you can make your own informed opinion, contrasting two different sides to a story. We don't have to trust one or the other at face value. I think we should question everything and really do our own research. But, places like the Canadian Institutes for Health Research says that doing your own research is a conspiracy theory. So they think that we're all pretty stupid, I think. But in this flame war of Sheila Annette Lewis, there's another tweet here by this Liberal candidate who happens to be an ER doctor, Dr. Doug Elfson. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he's in Manitoba. He retweeted Roman's post, reposted. Sorry, my language is, I don't know how to deal with this renaming of Twitter. But he said a patient would be refused a liver transplant if they refused to stop drinking, and would be refused a lung transplant if they refused to stop smoking. This is no different. CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, is promoting dangerous medical misinformation, and it is killing people. There's there's so much to chat about there, but I really liked some of the comments where people were saying, well, if someone wouldn't was drinking and that's what caused their liver damage, then that, like, these are not mutually exclusive. These are not one and the same thing, to be comparing whether or not someone takes a COVID shot to receive an organ transplant for something totally unrelated to whether or not COVID caused their organ failure or whatnot. This is a logical fallacy, essentially.
Well,
And
and
this is coming from a
remember,
doctor.
yeah. With Sheila Annette Lewis, she did everything that was required of her to get the up to be on the list for the transplant. Everything she did right. She made sure every T was crossed, every I was dotted. The only thing she didn't do was take the new novel injection for COVID that was introduced after the 2020 pandemic. She was diagnosed in, I believe, 2019, shortly around that time. And it was only then introduced, and it was mandated to her after she had basically completed every step required of her. So it's not nearly the same as he's, ascribing it to be. And the fact of the matter is, this one thing is the reason why she wasn't allowed that transplant. It wasn't that she was a bad person to receive it, or she wasn't, fit enough for it. At the time, she was ready, willing, able to go. Everything was ready for her, except the COVID vaccine was then in the way, only a simple year after it was introduced.
Yeah, it's absolutely absurd to try to make that. It's comparing apples to oranges, really. If you're a heavy drinker and you're in late stage liver failure and you refuse to stop drinking, and that's why you've been removed or do not qualify for an organ transplant, I can understand the logic, the reasoning, and the rationale for that. If you're a chronic heavy smoker and you need a lung transplant, but you refuse to quit smoking, and that counters your eligibility to receive a lung transplant, I can understand that scientific rationale. But this idea that because you didn't take an ineffective shot that's shown to be not as safe and effective as it was originally enticed to us to be, it doesn't make logical sense. And then someone dug up this other post by the same doctor where he says he's standing on a roadway here. He says, in Vancouver today, a little over 1 year ago, I had a cardiac arrest right here. Now every day is a gift. Thanks so much to the bystanders and paramedics who saved my life, and so on and so forth. But he's really part of this, shall I say, new normal of sudden cardiac arrest. We're seeing these situations and these instances unfold more and more. And I know, Sid, you kind of alluded to this already, but we do have to be careful with what we say on YouTube because of their arbitrary and ever evolving and changing community standards. We've already been demonetized off of that platform. And if we get too far into the questioning of the science nitty gritty, we risk being deplatformed there completely. I think any day now, like really, we could just be on the chopping block at any time. But you can take it for what you will and take it for yourself that this is the same individual who had a heart attack a year ago. Probably, it looks like he's a little bit into fitness, so maybe he was out for a run, and we see that happening more and more with wrestlers, UFC fighters on the field during live games. These athletes, just while they're exercising, while they're engaged in sport or otherwise, seem to be having these really once freak accidents where they suffer cardiac arrest or other heart-related issues on the field. And I wonder what's changed over the last 2 years that could, contribute to something like that.
Well, maybe if I could just add one thing, and that is, back in the day, a celebrity would die or an athlete would die, and immediately they would tell you, oh, blank died of blank, right? There was a reason ascribed to their death. Now, all you see in the headline is that this person died, their family grieves their loss. They don't tell you, and you can read through the articles. They don't tell you why they died. And I'm sorry, but this is a trend I've noticed. I don't know if you've seen that as well, where it's just the causes of deaths aren't being listed anymore in news headlines.
Yeah, it's just this vague died suddenly idea. As though, young, fit, healthy athletes, not that this gentleman is necessarily young, but it looks like he's fairly fit, them suffering these events and, tragically, if some of them do die suddenly, that this is somehow being now normalized.